an honor to be delivering the Mitchell L. and Miriam Lewis Barnett Lecture. I just met Mimi before we started here tonight, and was really a pleasure to meet you, and I extend my condolences on the passing of your husband less than a year ago. It was really nice to meet you and have a little chat beforehand tonight. The 55th Annual Scholars Conference is a very special moment for me, and I thank Cindy Seaton Rogers for inviting me, and I will be delighted to take your questions afterward. I have a couple of shout-outs before I start. One of them is my friend Major Jordan is here with his wife Clarenda, and they live right up the road in McKinney, and they're here with their niece Abigail, who lives a little bit farther away in California. Very nice to see you here, and I appreciate your being here. Major played football at Dartmouth with my beloved friend Blair Dickerson, who was a classmate of mine in high school. Rabbi Richard Libowitz, who taught the first Holocaust course at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and invited my father to speak to his class, chaired the program for the 30th Annual Scholars Conference in 2000, at which I spoke. He'll be on a panel here tomorrow morning discussing the future of Holocaust studies. And those of you who have signed up for this conference will want to attend that. Among rabbis, Rick is a rather unique specimen, being a proud alumnus of Notre Dame. Would you stand, please?
Owes me a lunch still, and I do bring you greetings from Philadelphia, home of the Super Bowl champion Eagles.
Well, I wasn't going to mention that, but also with us tonight, I'm very happy to say, Joanne Mitchell, co-founder with her husband, Pastor Wayne Mitchell, of New Beginnings Orphanages International, an organization that supports orphans and their caregivers in Africa. I met Pastor Wayne last May when he flew from Dallas to Philly to officiate at the wedding of a mutual friend. He sent his regrets that he had to be in DC this weekend, but would the other half of this impressive power couple please stand? Thank you. You know, it's connections like these that remind us of our shared purpose, our common bond, and indeed the goal of the Scholars Conference. And being with you tonight is particularly meaningful to me because in December 1983, a year after my mother's death, more than 750 people packed the auditorium of the Jewish Community Center in my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, to listen to the Reverend Dr. Franklin Littell, the Methodist minister who co-founded the Scholars Conference after practically inventing the field of Holocaust studies with his 1975 book, The Crucifixion of the Jews. He delivered a stirring address dedicating a garden of the righteous Gentiles, the formal posthumous opening ceremony for the DREAM project begun 2 years earlier with a tree planting ceremony by my mother, Helena Wind Preston, the culmination of her life's work, a garden honoring Christians who saved the lives of Jews who came to reside in Delaware, including 2 trees honoring 2 otherwise ordinary men, Leopold Socha and Stefan Wróblewski, the Polish Catholic sewer workers who hid my mother and 9 other Jews for 14 months in 1943 and 44 in the sewers beneath the city of Lviv. Franklin Littell, who chaired the religion department at Temple University in Philadelphia, was a champion of brotherly love long before he arrived in Philly in the 60s. Way back in 1939, as a member of a Methodist youth group from Iowa, he confronted a Nazi at a party rally in Nuremberg. The son of an Iowa college professor, he was so appalled by Nazism that he devoted his life to building theological bridges. My mother regularly attended the annual Scholars Conference in Philadelphia, and when I accompanied her to one of them, I met the eminent Catholic scholar Harry James Cargis, author of many books on the subject, including When God and Man Failed, Reflections of a Post-Auschwitz Christian, and a Christian Response to the Holocaust. In 1988, he invited me to speak at his institution, Webster University in St. Louis, at an event honoring Elie Wiesel. And 2 years later, in 1990, I invited him to Wilmington to deliver the inaugural Helena Wynne Preston Memorial Lecture on the Holocaust, an ongoing series that will host its 13th lecture in September. As the Wilmington News Journal reported at the time, he told the audience that Hitler should be excommunicated. It was a decade after that, precisely 25 years ago, that Franklin Littell invited me to speak on professional ethics after Auschwitz. At the 30th Annual Scholars Conference I just mentioned, at which the honorary chair and keynote speaker was Elie Wiesel. Those heroes whose names I've just dropped, Leopold Socha, Stefan Wróblewski, Franklin Littell, Harry James Cargis, Elie Wiesel, Helena Wynne Preston, all of them are gone, leaving all of us to take up their work, the hard work, harder than ever before, the work of preserving humanity in challenging times. Somewhere, I believe, having done their work, they are listening and they are watching. And so, my friends, my emotions run deep as I stand before you tonight. When I was a little boy in Wilmington, my mother would tuck me in each night after I had placed my right hand on the mezuzah on my bedroom doorpost and kissed it. And we recited together the Hebrew prayer inside that begins, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The central tenet of our people, the prayer recited by Jews through the ages, the prayer on the lips of millions who were killed for their faith. Back then, I didn't know too much about the historical significance of the prayer, but I did know, as I drifted off to sleep, that unlike my friends and playmates, I had no grandparents to show up regularly to dote on me. I certainly didn't know anything about the historic city of Lviv, which also had been called Lvov, Lvov, Lemberg, Leopolis, depending on who ruled it. You'll hear me speak tonight of the sewers of Lviv, calling the city by its current Ukrainian name. And interspersed at various points, you'll see this image, 2 time-worn pages of Polish handwriting. Each time you see it, it's a signal that you're about to hear bits of translated writings from those pages, bits of hope from underground. When you see it, I invite you to imagine that you are Helena Wind, an impressionable young woman, barely in your 20s, from Turka nad Striem, or Turka on the Stree, a little town in the Carpathian Mountains of Poland, of the old Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia, hiding with strangers in a big city sewer, the sewers of Lviv in 1943 and 44, never seeing sunlight for 14 months, and you are writing. Spring, spring, calls the rising warm sun, nearing birdies in flight holler. Spring, calls the little street boy, holding in his hands a bouquet of snowdrops for sale, with a facial expression as if he would in fact be the dictator of this occurring atmospheric change. Spring, beaming from the changed decorations in store windows, beaming from the gardener's face as he begins his work in a city garden. Spring, finally beaming from the face of each and every pedestrian, old and young, rich and poor. Before the war, the first harbinger of spring, which had yet to come, however still distant, was the appearance of the first straw hats on the cobblestone streets on the heads of elegant ladies. And this so early at times, however, through the law of nature as well as with the factual condition of things, it was still winter in the full common meaning of the word. Then some extravagant ones, as if in spite of nature's will, wanting to impose their own will on the world and conduct an assault on the condition of winter on their own. First with the hats, later a spring outfit, finally, a beat for blush without a snowman. There now a revolutionary ceremonial inauguration of spring. There now external signs of the goodness of nature. But internally, this internal certain inexpressible joy embracing the soul, the mind, some indescribable happiness overcomes a person, somehow blissful on the soul. The war broke out. With it descended, as usual, destruction, leaving in its wake victims, blood all around, corpses, blood. And it would seem that this human misfortune should be paired with sadness, crying, tears, that from the face of man smile will disappear forever, and from his frame of mind happiness. And maybe it would have been so, if not for those superhuman phenomena, those the only ones which are able to make impossible things a reality, and those seemingly possible unrealistic. It is the eternal law of nature. And in reality, today, the 5th year of the war, the 5th year from the moment when some rampaging satanic element of destruction surrounded the whole world, we can state that everything has changed, that forms of life underwent external change, manners and traditions, the character of nature, and it jabs at mankind, man's outlook and his needs, his disposition and habits. Only one thing has not changed, that which is done by the higher will, over which no change can be made with earthly might, that in which changes occur abstractly, independently of human will and strength. The split-level house in the Wilmington suburbs where I grew up was in a middle-class development called Hyde Park. One day, a crew of sewer workers showed up in the street in front of our house on Wordsworth Drive to work on the sewer line. How amused they were when my mother came outside to talk with them, and how excited she was to bring out refreshments and regale them with stories from her life in the sewer. We moved into the newly built house on my first birthday, January 5th, 1956, and 6 decades later, I sold it at the end of August 2015. I posed here with a friend on September the 1st, 2015, after we had thrown the last contents into bags for the trash trucks. My father, an aspiring artist from Poland, a French-educated engineer named Grisha Prishkulnik, who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald, became a DuPont engineer in Delaware named George Preston, who tried unsuccessfully to convey his proficiency in chess to his son, and sometimes he even let me win. Our house had many examples of his artistry and craftsmanship, including these lamps he had made as a sideline while working as an engineer for Stone & Webster in Boston in the late 40s. And this clay figure he had molded in the 60s in Wilmington, which I found in the garage 10 years ago. He outlived my mother by 24 years. I'm going to show you a couple of short film clips now. The first one is 4 minutes long from 1987, followed by a shorter and much more recent one from 2021.
My mother escaped from a prison and fell in with a group of Jews who were still alive in the ghetto of Lvov. And on June the 1st of 1943, when the Nazis and their helpers rounded up the last Jews and liquidated the final Jewish ghetto of that city, my mother found herself with a group of Jews being pulled into a sewer. There was a trio of sewer workers led by a man named Leopold Socha that risked their lives to save this group of Jews. No one knew how long it was going to last, but it lasted 14 months. At the end of July of 1944, 10 Jews emerged from a manhole in the courtyard of a monastery in Lvov. And among them was my mother.
Helena Wind Preston, Holocaust survivor, started a memorial for Christians who risked their lives and their families in order to save Jews during the Nazi Holocaust. The Garden of Righteous Gentiles honors and remembers these brave people.
What you have here is all you can have in reference to those who are not Jewish, and that is monuments to individual people. And what we are commemorating here are the acts of individuals.
My mother knew that she owed her life to 3 Catholic sewer workers. So one of the burning desires that she had throughout her years in the United States was to somehow honor these people and others like them. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has a memorial to these righteous among the nations, which they call the Avenue of the Righteous. And through the years, they have planted trees in honor of these individuals. So we have here in Wilmington, in front of the Jewish Community Center, the first monument in the United States honoring Christians who saved Jewish lives during the Nazi Holocaust.
What I like about the trees is the fact that we are talking about a living organism. We are talking about something that ties the physical to the spiritual.
My mother had hoped that this garden would become an educational tool, and she hoped that the garden would symbolize the connection among all people and the connection between Jews and Christians and the love that can exist.
There are two trees here that honor two simple men who, as it comes down to it, risked their lives so that I eventually could actually exist. I owe my existence to their act of heroism.
My mother was in the group of Jews who hid for 14 months in the sewers beneath the city of Lviv.
Клеймом Львівського пивзаводу. Пляшечка.
Ось, баранчик. Він точно польський. І він...
Зараз я буду тут.
You know, I think that the discovery demonstrates that there's not only a great interest, but there's also a great desire on the part of many young Ukrainians to set straight the history and to prevent it from being corrupted. And so I take my hat off to them for doing this.
Не будь я... Блях. Далі.
The 1987 spotlight on the Delaware Garden was telecast regularly between programs on Philadelphia's PBS affiliate, WHYY. Fast forward to 2021 and the NBC News footage of a group of young Ukrainian explorers venturing into the sewers of Lviv who found artifacts belonging to my mother's group. Barely a year later, in February 2022, Russia would launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And today, residents of Lviv frequently find themselves hiding not in the sewers, but in basement bomb shelters throughout the city. I took this photo in Lviv 4 decades ago, in 1984, when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. How does one find hope in such circumstances? For Halina Wind, who spoke Polish and Yiddish with her fellow sewer dwellers, it was paramount to maintain in her brain an address in English, 3080 Broadway in New York. For that was where she knew she could reach her brother should she survive. The address of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he was studying to become a rabbi, and where she herself had been admitted into the Teachers Institute in 1939, just before the war broke out. My mother had left Turka in November 1942, wearing a Virgin Mary medallion from her father's shop and using the name of a Polish Catholic girl she knew from school who had moved away, Halina Nashkevich. She boarded a train for the big city, Lviv. There, she was betrayed by her Polish landlady and sent to a Nazi prison where she was ordered to sign her own death sentence. She escaped, joined a group of Jews in the ghetto, and on April 27, 1943, she obtained official Aryan papers under the name Halina Dienstag that enabled her to work for the German factory Schwarz und Kopf, repairing clothes of murdered Jews to be sent to Germany. A month later, as she was to learn, on May 22, 1943, on the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer, the Germans took away my grandfather, the watchmaker, along with my grandmother and uncle. They were murdered either in Sambor or in Belzec. Until the fateful terror of October 7th, 2023, we Jews had not been confronted with such a catastrophe since the night 80 years earlier, June the 1st, 1943, when the Germans liquidated the Jewish ghetto of Lviv, and my mother was among hundreds of terrified, desperate Jews who fled into the municipal sewer system. Most were swept up in the raging underground waters of the Peltiv River and drowned. But Halina Wind, the educated, pampered daughter of a Hasidic watchmaker in the Carpathian Mountains, suddenly found herself at 21 in the bowels of the big city, living with rats as big as cats, yet with an unlikely advantage: those Polish Catholic sewer workers. For the next 14 months, until the Red Army liberated Lviv from the Germans at the end of July 1944, Leopold Socha and Stefan Wróblewski risked their lives and their families' lives to save my mother and 9 other Jews. She was born Feiga Wind, or Feidja, F-E-I-D-Z-I-A, as she spelled it in the letters to her brother in the U.S., and as they, for some reason, pronounced it, or Fanka, or Tzipora, or eventually Halina Wind. She was the daughter of Osyash, or Joshua, or Shia Wind, this poor watchmaker whom she revered as saintly, a pious Belzer Chassid in Turka, that dusty, bucolic outpost in the Carpathian Mountains. In 1937, my teenage mother stood in the doorway of the shop in which she grew up, beneath the sign, Osyash Wind, watchmaker. In the basement, beneath a trap door, after the Germans arrived in Turka, my mother and her parents and younger brother would hide during every Nazi Aktia, or killing spree, one of which resulted in her grandmother's execution right outside their home. The Yiddish name Feiga and the Hebrew name Tzipora both mean little bird, and so I titled my first magazine article about her, A Bird in the Wind, published on Mother's Day, 1983, 5 months after she died. Turka nad Striem, or Turka upon the Stree, was a town split evenly among Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. Brought up in the spiritually rich home of that poor Belzer Chassid, where most Jews attended this synagogue, now a Ukrainian woodworking shop, my mother led her post-war life imbued by the conservative Judaism of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York City, which also had trained her older brother to become Rabbi Leon Wind of Manchester, Connecticut. She passed the values and principles absorbed in the watchmaker's home on to Jewish students in her adopted city of Wilmington. Her older brother had attained a science degree from the University in Lviv, but in 1938 he escaped the rising violence against Jews with a precious student visa that enabled him to sail to New York, to study at the seminary, to become a rabbi, a conservative rabbi. She, meanwhile, was learning to live in a sewer with a group of strangers. This month marks 60 years since the great Jewish scholar, philosopher, and civil rights activist, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, walked arm in arm with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Third Civil Rights March from Selma to the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, a march that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. When I marched in Selma, Heschel wrote, "My feet were praying." That's him with the white hair and beard, second from right, in this iconic AP photo from Sunday, March 21st, 1965. And that's 25-year-old John Lewis at far left. Why am I mentioning this? Well, let me quote from my mother's eulogy for Heschel, which she delivered at a memorial service in January 1973. Quote, "In a sense, he met me before I had the privilege of meeting him. Upon liberation on July 27, 1944, I immediately began sending what was to become a long series of letters to 3080 Broadway in New York. That is the address of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where my brother had been a student before the war, and which, to my knowledge at the time, was his last residence. The war was not yet over, and so it was not until sometime in 1945 that one of those letters arrived at its destination. Instead of forwarding that letter to my brother, who by then had graduated and was leading a congregation in Connecticut, a decision was made to open and read it. Perhaps it was done out of consideration for him, to soften the blow in case the message was too shocking. As I recall it, it was brief. Everyone was killed. I survived. Send me readmission papers to the seminary. The man who read and translated my first life signal was another Polish Jew, himself rather new at the seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Although Polish was her native tongue, and although she arrived in New York in 1947 with a limited English vocabulary, Helena Wind became the first survivor of the Nazis to speak across the United States about her survival. When she was 27 years old in 1949, the seminary sent her around the country to raise money for its scholarship fund, still called Torah Fund today. In fact, the first audience to hear about the sewers of Lviv was on Tuesday, October 25th, 1949, when Helena Wind addressed the 6th Annual Torah Fund Conference of the National Women's League of the United Synagogue of America at B'nai Jeshurun Congregation on West 88th Street in Manhattan. As the special conference edition of Torah Fund News from November-December 1949 reported, for the next 3/4 of an hour, every woman present sat transfixed, while Miss Helena Wind related how her deep-rooted faith had sustained her through incredible suffering. Miss Wind is a senior student in the Teachers Institute of the seminary. My story, she said, is related to a convention like this. For the purpose of my speaking here is to show you the tremendous value of Jewish upbringing, how it helps a person in distress overcome insurmountable difficulties and prevents him from complete mental and spiritual disintegration. From 1949 to 1953, she made 40 appearances in 30 cities in 9 states and the District of Columbia. Beginning when she was still studying for the Bachelor of Religious Education degree she would receive in June of 1950. Her appearances were widely covered in the press, as evidenced by this front page story in the Boston Sunday Globe of April 16, 1950. And when she spoke in Camden, New Jersey, a woman named Diana Sherman was so mesmerized that she wrote to a cousin who was working as an engineer in Boston and making lamps as a hobby. Quote, her speech was about her experiences she lived through during Nazi terrorism, Diana Sherman wrote to her cousin on April 6, 1950. She spoke so effectively that her speech was printed in a magazine so that those who did not hear her story could read it. She is not an ordinary girl. She is strikingly good-looking, intelligent, and has fine feelings. The magazine to which Diana Sherman referred was the December 1949 issue of Women's League Outlook. The headline, "The Torah is a Tree of Life." Well, Diana Sherman's letter had an impact. After a short courtship, Helena Wind and George Preston, the former Grisha Prishkolnik, were married in 1951 by my mother's brother, Rabbi Leon Wind, at Temple Beth Shalom in Manchester, Connecticut, the congregation he would serve for a half-century. They settled in Wilmington, where George had taken a job as an electrical engineer with DuPont. And Helena Wind Preston became a beloved Jewish educator and Delaware's acknowledged spokeswoman for the victims and survivors of the Holocaust. Winter has passed. Worries have passed. The sun into its arms embraced the whole world, letting man feel that from that which is godly, the great and the small may equally partake. Winter has been hard, the 5th winter of war. Many people not properly clothed, without fuel, without bread, began already to complain. Why God so generous with misery, and for happiness the wait is so long? But God is immortal, and his masterpieces eternal. And although all as a result of war succumb to change, that which he governs, that is so safe that in spite of all the changes, unchanged it will remain. Winter has passed. Along with it, worries of fuel, warm clothing, of a hat for the ears. Seems as if the earth experienced relaxation. Lighter is the air, lighter is the clothing. And it seems to man that lighter is his soul. Winter has passed. The sun rises earlier, knowing the obligation which on it rests. 'Tis after all his merit that the earth bears crops, and the meadow and field covers itself with green. Nature resurrects toward new life, and in people some strange change occurs, something so blissful in the heart that man himself knows not why, sending smiles to everyone around when leaving home in the morning, walks out into the street, lifting up his head, and to the smile of the sun answers with a smile, grateful for surviving till spring and for an uncountable time, in prayer gives sincere thanks to God. I was 10 years old in 1965 when my father was invited to Frankfurt to testify at the Auschwitz war crimes trials, a news story around the world. His testimony helped convict a Nazi capo named Emil Bednarik. My father was a native of the large Jewish cultural mecca of Rovno in Volhynia, part of Russia, when he was born in 1914, and he grew up there when it was Rovno, Poland. Now it's Rivne, Ukraine. My father wanted to be an artist, but my grandfather insisted he study for a profession. And so he went, I knew that was going to happen. And so he went off to Vilnius and Warsaw. But in both cities, rising anti-Semitism in the universities made it impossible for him to stay. Does this sound sadly familiar? So he went to France, where he supported himself as an engineering student by drawing caricatures of tourists along the Seine in Paris. He got a master's degree in electrical and mechanical engineering in Normandy. That's him on the left, at the far left, at the University of Caen. And he was working as an engineer in Lille when he was arrested by the Gestapo on August 8th, 1942. His technical training enabled him to survive Auschwitz as a slave laborer for Siemens, working in a subcamp called Bobreck, making dies for parts for German submarines. He was Auschwitz tattoo number 160581, and he survived 14 months in Auschwitz-Birkenau. But he was not liberated there. On the night of January 17, 1945, 10 days before the camp was liberated by Allied troops, he was led with thousands of others on foot and then by railroad flat car to a camp near the German city of Weimar, a camp called Buchenwald. There he was designated by a cloth patch that made him Buchenwald number 124049. On April 11th, 1945, before the SS could kill the last prisoners, American tanks plowed through the barbed wire and liberated Buchenwald. My father was a walking skeleton, weighing 80 pounds. Somehow, despite 3 years of constant exposure to some of the most brutal atrocities in history, he retained a sense of humor. When I was born in 1955 in Wilmington General Hospital, he knew exactly how he wanted to announce the event, with a blueprint of a baby boy arrangement. On Wordsworth Drive, his painting of my mother held a prominent spot in their bedroom, but his fanciful self-portrait occupied a far lesser place in a corner of the rec room. Today, both paintings are displayed in our dining room in Philadelphia. Underground, almost a decade ago, when I emptied out the house on Wordsworth Drive to prepare it for sale, I found 2 dusty, musty, moldy, smelly, rolled-up canvases on the floor of the crawl space. Clearly, they had been there since we moved into the house in 1956. I held my nose and inspected them and quickly realized what they were. 80 years ago, in August 1945, just 4 months after his liberation from Buchenwald, my father painted these watercolors soon after returning to France. He did not display them on Wordsworth Drive, maybe even forgot about them. He painted them in 2 bucolic locations outside Lille, where he had returned after the war. The one on the left is inscribed August 27th, 1945, in Marigny. The one on the right, August 5th, 1945, in Pont-à-Marc. Both bear his distinctive initials. I placed the smelly artifacts in the trunk of our car and brought them back to Philadelphia, where I had them professionally restored, cleaned, and framed. They hold a prominent spot on our living room wall. Down below, underneath the city, about 1.5 meters, forgotten by people and maybe even unknown, there is a vault. Literally a rat's burrow, from clay alone, stones, a constructed cave. To describe it with words, it's a live tomb. Some time ago, it was to be the underground of a monastery. One thing is certain, that surely no wanderer has gone down into this hole until now. In short, this story is an unknown one, and rightly so. Evidence indicating that this long ago supposedly was a canal, a branch off from the main pipe leading to the Peltov. In this side canal, it is today that a year passes. A group of people escaping from under the hand of the executioner found a shelter and live here already for a year, intermittently passing from joy to suffering. How does one find hope underground? If you're Helena Wind, you do it by writing, extolling the virtues of your rescuers, recalling happier times and troubling times. Through her eloquent voice, we learn how her upbringing sustained and fortified her in the filthy underground hideout, just as she appreciated the faith that motivated the sewer workers. Although I inherited plenty of family footage shot by my father and significant tape recordings as well, it was not until a year before my mother's death that someone filmed her speaking. On Friday, May the 1st, 1981, a WHYY reporter interviewed her at the Holocaust Monument in Freedom Plaza in Wilmington, just before she delivered the address at the city's first community-wide Yom HaShoah remembrance ceremony. This short film clip from 1981 contains the only known footage of my mother speaking.
About 60 members of the Building and Construction Trades Council of Delaware picketed near the firm's construction entrance. Officials say the action was an informational picket caused by contract negotiations. By 9:30 this morning, most of the picketers had left the scene. 36 years ago, 6 million Jews were exterminated under a systematic program of genocide in Nazi Germany. Today opens the Days of Remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. Channel 12's Elma Andrews files this report.
The Days of Remembrance to commemorate the Nazi Holocaust were officially voted on by Congress last October. The event calls on all national and local leaders and communities to confront the massive slaughter in Germany of the Jewish population. About 150 people, elected officials, and clergy gathered today in Freedom Plaza in Wilmington.
There's a dual message to today's ceremonies. One is to remember the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, but there's also a double meaning, and that's to remember that we must never let something like that that happen again? We have one of the victims of the concentration camps with us today, Miss Lee Preston. Do you think that it can happen again?
Absolutely. In the early years, immediately following the liberation, when I say the liberation, sounds like deliberation, we did not believe so because we were absolutely convinced that the world will take note of what happened and will do its utmost to see to it that everybody knows about it, that everybody will make an effort to prevent that it never happens again. But as we have been watching the world these last 36 years since liberation, things are getting worse. Hatred is increasing, persecution is increasing, and what we are afraid about that while there is still the blueprint for the old genocide, someone might very well use it and plan a second genocide, and as I mentioned, the victims may be just about anybody.
Among the dignitaries at today's ceremonies were William McLaughlin, Mayor of Wilmington, Lieutenant Governor Mike Castle, and County Executive Rick Collins. More services will be held at Freedom Plaza on Sunday afternoon. Elma Andrews, Channel 12 News.
Six months later, in a solemn ceremony, on the rainy morning of November 16, 1981, about 50 people attended a tree planting ceremony at which my mother dedicated the Garden of the Righteous Gentiles, the first monument in the United States to Christians who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust, and the first monument of its kind outside of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Two of the trees honored Leopold Socha and Stefan Wróblewski, the Polish Catholic sewer workers who saved her life in the sewers of Lviv. After that ceremony, a year after that ceremony, my father retired from DuPont, and they looked forward to the future together. I join with your many friends in DuPont in wishing you and your wife, Helena, happiness in the years ahead, wrote R.L. Schobert, director of the DuPont Engineering Department Design Division, on Tuesday, November 30. 2 days later, on September 2nd, after cardiac bypass surgery, my mother was gone at 60. Shockingly, having survived so much, she was gone. Distraught, my father was able to pick up the pieces of his life once more when the company invited him to return to work for several more years in the same job, but now as a consultant. And he started speaking about his experiences as well. I once read beautiful fairy tales about quiet heroes unknown to us. About that, the memory of them does not extinguish, even when a given hero dies, that he lives forever, although the man dies. I also read about mothers of Poland, Polish mothers, generous, sacrificial, full of sacrifices. Over the years, the inspiring story of the rescue of my mother's group has drawn attention in books and films, including the Oscar-nominated 2011 movie In Darkness by the Polish director Agnieszka Holland. In fact, on September 19, 1948, NBC radio listeners heard a professional dramatic reading of Tzipora, an episode of the weekly program The Eternal Light, based on an autobiographical essay by my mother, Tzipora Wind, a 26-year-old student in the seminary's Teachers Institute. You can hear the actual radio program on my website. This is my mother with the sewer worker Socha at her birthday on March 1st, 1946, in Gliwice, Poland. Just 2 months before he was struck down by a Russian truck there while riding bicycles with his daughter. On August 24, 1983, having read my Mother's Day magazine article, A Bird in the Wind, the surviving Polish sewer worker, Wroblewski, wrote me an 8-page letter in Polish, providing specific details of the Lviv sewer rescue. He died in 1984, 2 weeks before I arrived at his doorstep in Gliwice to interview him. I am a Jew. Therefore, people offer pity. After all, I am young, healthy. They do not see, they do not feel. I have a heart, a beautiful heart, a crystalline soul. They do not hear. Must I perish in contempt? To you, good, noble people who have done so much, and during difficult moments of sadness, pain, of despair, you came to us, gave a helping hand, offered shelter. Do you know what this means? Akcja in March. By the gate, they lynched militiamen. In the winter, they murdered, cut down our brothers, dragging out from homes, discovering the bunkers, and we're spared. Do you know what this means? Liquidation of the ghetto, finishing off the Jews. Have to trust in God. It won't get any different. Rape, murder, and tyranny. They were robbing people's property. Again, we're spared. Do you know what this means? Thousands of our fellow believers perished so miserably, looking helplessly into the eyes of the approaching loss. And for us, the Lord God sent 3 heavenly rescuers so that they can save us. Do you know what this means? And so, from the first moment, for 9 months already, what fatherly care you are surrounding us with, feeding us, respecting, working harder and harder. You guard us without reservation. And we know what that means. But maybe the day of victory is not far off, and the work in which you put so much effort today will be crowned with the highest laurel of bravery, which will amaze the whole world, and you will understand what it means. In July 1977, my mother traveled to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to provide the sole testimony that led to the designation of righteous among the nations for Socha and Wroblewski and their wives, guaranteeing monthly stipends to those families in Poland during the difficult years of post-war Soviet domination. A year later, in 1978, in a comprehensive interview for the University of Delaware Oral History Project, recorded over 2 days in the house on Wordsworth Drive while I was in grad school in Missouri, my mother revealed that she still had a handkerchief that had been damaged by a fire in the kerosene Primus stove they used for cooking soup in the sewers of Lviv. She sometimes spoke of writing poetry and prose in the sewer, but had never shown those writings to anyone. After the Red Army liberated Lviv and my mother emerged from the sewers at the end of July 1944, she returned one day to her childhood home, to the dusty mountain town of Turka nad Strijem, where a Polish sign still proclaimed her father's name and business, Osiasz Wind, watchmaker. Like almost all of Turka's 6,000 Jews, her parents and younger brother had been murdered. The house was vacant, the watchmaker's shop looted, the rooms bare. In the basement, in a dusty corner on the floor, she found an old ledger in which the watchmaker had recorded some transactions. She scooped it up, put it in her pocket, went back upstairs, stood in the center of the empty room, walked to the front entrance, and kissed the mezuzah still fastened there on the doorpost. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Carefully, she removed the contents, and then, holding the parchment in her hand, she walked away from her father's house forever. My uncle gave me a shoebox filled with 114 letters written to him in Polish by my mother after her ordeal, sent from Gliwice, Warsaw, Prague, and Karlovy Vary, or Carlsbad. In 1987, I even spent a night with friends in a St. Louis sewer, deep inside this pipe, just to get a taste of the experience. Still, I hungered for more, but I had practically given up hope of finding her sewer writings. And then, a decade ago, on August 28th, 2015, the birthday in 1909 of the sewer worker Leopold Socha, on one of our final trips from Philadelphia to empty the house on Wordsworth Drive, 9 years after my father took his last breath in their bedroom at age 92, his mouth agape and his Auschwitz number 160581 glistening on his skin. I retrieved from an outdoor shed a cardboard box that once held Xerox computer paper and now was packed with a jumble of decades of miscellanea because he had lost his vision to glaucoma. Using my father's wheelbarrow, the wheelbarrow I had gripped as a faithful friend so many times as I helped my father through the years, I moved the box to the spot where I was going through materials beneath my parents' window on the patio he had built when I was a year old, where he erected a basketball net when I was a boy so I could practice my shot. Surrounded by mature pines and Lombardy poplars and weeping willows and apple and cherry trees he'd planted as seeds. I reached into the box and discovered near the bottom an old envelope marked in pencil in my mother's hand, kanal, Polish for sewer. Impatiently but gingerly, I pulled out the contents, a fire-damaged green handkerchief with checkered brown trim from her 14 months in hiding, and 4 soiled dog-eared notebooks, each roughly 8 by 5.5 inches, with rusted staples, 167 pages filled with her Polish prose and poetry, themselves in hiding, waiting to be discovered. Holding in my hands the dirt-encrusted pages containing my mother's distinctive writing, The writings I had only heard about, the only known contemporaneous writings from those depths, I was exhilarated. And my wife, Rondi, took my picture. Standing in the backyard, I held the Xerox box that might have been discarded had I not insisted we look through every last item. This corner of one notebook shows the beginning of her final stanzas from the sewer. At times I sit like this. I think about it. I sit and trace. My life has a strange road. It is a miracle of providence. It is a great wonder that my bones are not rotting, that my bones still have skin, that the human is still alive, broken, shattered. In this way, we descended into the shelter in order to start life here, in order to set up a home here, and no one would believe, and everyone would mock how a human survived here, how a human rotted here. And so it was destined for me, be it from heaven or elsewhere, to experience a crazy life, to go against the current of fashion. However, God is clearly watching over those like me and removes for them on time misfortunes and evil. We went through a lot, having survived oppression. More than one storm interrupted our night, and no one is able to dream it up in sleep. It is fate making frolic what has happened to me. I inherited a treasure trove of material from both of my parents because family correspondence was saved, because my mother returned to her hometown after surviving the sewers of Lviv and scooped up those few keepsakes from the basement and the mezuzah from the doorpost and brought them with her when she arrived in New York in January 1947 on a flight from Prague. Because my uncle was able to leave Poland in 1938 to study at the New York Seminary, I have his family photos. And because my father's non-Jewish girlfriend in France kept the extraordinary 80-page leather-bound photo scrapbook he had started in Rovna, this is the first page, all photos of himself. She kept his boyhood mandolins and his artwork and their correspondence just in case he might survive. And I inherited those cherished artifacts because he brought them with him when he eventually arrived in New York in March 1946 on a flight from Paris. I inherited his Buchenwald prisoner uniform, as well as his mandolins, even his first mandolin, in which, as a boy, he glued into the sound box a tiny photo portrait of himself, the mandolin his uncle had given him in Rovna. 8 years ago, on February 6, 2017, Rondi and I were in Turka with a driver and an interpreter when we visited a small Ukrainian museum in search of any old photos that might be of interest. Finding none, we were told nothing else could be done. So we went out to lunch. After our meal, fortified by vodka, I said, let's go back to the museum. I have a hunch we haven't been shown everything. So we returned to the museum, and I said, are you sure you have no other photos? The woman begrudgingly led us into a small room and pulled out a shoebox filled with old photos from every decade. As Rondi and the others stood patiently nearby, I sat down with the box and in 2 minutes pulled out a photo of my mother. There in Turka, a town with no more Poles or Jews, I found my mother, Fija Wind, age 14, shown on December 18, 1936, in the center, directly between the seated teachers, in the 7th grade of the Josef Pilsudski School, Turka's private gymnasium or high school, the only Jewish girl in her class. The watchmaker's shop in Turka is gone now. The house where my mother grew up, the house she revisited after the sewers and found in vacant disarray, the house from which she removed the family mezuzah, is now a dress shop. On Wordsworth Drive, above the circular gas thermostat in the dining room, hung the parchment scroll of calligraphy from that mezuzah, the words she would recite with me from a prayer book at bedtime. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The affirmation of one God, which my father mounted on burlap and framed for all to see. It hangs today beneath the thermostat in our home in Philadelphia. I think my mother intended for me to find her sewer notebooks when I grew old enough to grapple with them. These Polish writings shine a light into the depths of darkness and the possibilities of retaining humanity there, confirming my mother's ultimate faith in the children, myself included, whom she taught all those years ago. My mother's early ability to process the inhumanity and the loss, I believe, lies partly in the fact that while my father was learning every day about brutality and terror during 15 months in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, my mother was learning underground about heroism, about what it means for Catholic sewer workers to risk their lives and their families' lives to save Jews, because they had the moral courage to rise above the madness around them, because they valued human life. I believe it was this fact, this firsthand knowledge, that people had the capacity to be good and brave and righteous, that empowered her to speak without bitterness, without vindictiveness, without hatred, to sensitize people of all ages, religions, and races. In addition to those precious family heirlooms, I have inherited something else, the responsibility to remember. My father's father, David Leib Priskolnik, for whom I was named, shown here in a tiny snapshot from 1939 at home in Rovno, present-day Rivne, Ukraine, was among 23,500 Jewish men, women, and children shot to death by German death squads and local collaborationists over 3 days, November 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1941. The massacre in the Sosonki forest 83 years ago also claimed the life of my teenage uncle, Yasha. As fate would have it, my father died on November 8th, 2006, exactly 65 years after his father and brother were murdered. My friends, to live 14 months in a sewer is almost impossible to imagine. But the hostages in Gaza, those who are still alive, are now held more than 17 months, mostly in underground tunnels. Meanwhile, both in Israel and in Ukraine, when the alarms sound, residents must flee into underground shelters. At this perilous moment, this moment when we see our world changing dramatically in ways that are at once frightening and familiar, let us reflect on the fleeting nature of time and on our precious freedoms, and let us resolve to strengthen our fragile bonds. May we all find hope in these challenging times. Sometimes we might even find it underground. Thank you.